Hello, my name is Dr. Scott Frey, and I'm here with two authors of Scary Monsters, and with the subtitle Monstrosity, Masculinity in Popular Culture. The two authors are Mark Duffett and John Hackett. I'm going to ask them some questions, but initially they're going to do short readings of pertinent chapters from their excellent book.
So do you want me to go first then?
If you want to go first, John.
Okay then. So that I'm going to read something from towards the beginning of the chapter 4 of the book, which is about Frankenstein and glam rock. One of the most intriguing themes in Simon Reynolds's recent book on glam rock is its recurrent analysis of a series of quasi-magical connotations of the musical genre. First, and most obviously, there is the derivation of glam from glamour, a term popularized by Walter Scott and originally referring to visual illusions. There is also, quote, an etymological connection between glamour and word magic, end of quote, which might put us in mind of Slade's orthographic licensing and song titles such as Mama, We're All Crazy Now of 1972, a refrain that might also serve as a performative speech act, resembling word magic on a willingly suggestible audience. Other signifiers of magic are present in the discussion of glam's spearhead, Mark Bolan, who used to boast of a sojourn in Paris with a wizard as part of his own myth-making, especially in told tales to interviewers. As Reynolds argues, the concept of magic and the conception of himself as a magical being was central to Bolan's outlook and work. Words like magic and spell crop up continually in his interviews and frequently in his lyrics. Reynolds follows this with a discussion of Roger Melly's assertion that magic is far more important than talent in popular culture. Specifically, Melly alludes to charisma, which Reynolds traces to the ancient Greek charis before its adoption by Christianity, referring to grace. Reynolds's modern gloss, which captures the collectivity of both early Christian church and modern musical subcultures, is collective single-mindedness or vibe. A further set of magical references are present in the discussion of another central glam figure, David Bowie, and his interest during his wayward Thin White Duke phase in the occult. Of Bowie during this period, in his self-imposed exile in Los Angeles, Reynolds observes, "The devil finds things for idle minds to dwell on." The magical lexis moves glam rock as a genre closer once more to the Frankenstein myth. Mary Shelley's novel was subtitled "Or the Modern Prometheus," alluding to the titan of ancient Greek myth, Victor Frankenstein himself as the modern Prometheus. As Markman Ellis emphasizes, it is the alchemical arts and not modern science that is the object of this cautionary tale, and which provides Victor with his supernatural agency. Conversely, in the novel, Frankenstein that is, charisma is aligned firmly with the creature. Unlike in the celluloid version, Shelley's creation is articulate, keenly perceptive, and decisive where Victor is faltering. When cajoling Victor into creating a mate for him, after the former has destroyed his work so far, the creature commands him, "You are my creator, but I am your master, obey." Though unsuccessful in this command, the creature's influence on the events in the novel, before and after this, utterly confounds Victor's own capacity for action. This turning of the tables from creature to creator anticipates perhaps the popular usage's transfer of the proper name Frankenstein itself. In terms of popular music, perhaps the collective single-mindedness, according to Reynolds's gloss of popular culture following Melly, at least potentially represents a more democratic version of the creature's demand for recognition in the novel. Here, the glam scene itself and relations between audience and performers might reinstate this. Another affinity of the glam rock genre with the Frankenstein myth is in Victor Frankenstein's method of creation, which has notable affinities with the bricolage emphasized in Dick Hebdige's account of style in musical subcultures. The creature is composed of bits and bobs, human and animal. Glam rock, too, has at times been characterized as a hybrid or motley assortment of stylistic and musical influences. In relation to David Bowie, for instance, Richard Mills argues that each Bowie look is an assemblage of fashion curiosities, a hodgepodge of clues to Bowie's influences. This ties in with what Margaret F. Savalonis characterises as the overt construction of multiple personae facilitated by the conventions of glam. There may indeed be something magical or alchemical in the artifice and animation of as disparate a series of stylistic ingredients as are present in glam style and performance. This is present in the various identities, costumes, and musical styles that glam assembles with self-conscious and shameless artifice. But in case these observations appear rather fanciful or impressionistic, some case studies of particular glam performers are now in order. And I'll break off there without launching into any of those case studies.
Okay, now over to Mark Duffett, who's going to give a reading.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm reading from page 83 onwards, which is a section at the end of the chapter on Colonel Parker, Elvis Presley's manager, and it's titled Mutually Assured Destruction. Parker's image represents a kind of shell game in which it's hard to spot the true cause of Elvis's downfall. Exactly what the Colonel mythically personifies, however, is open to question. A prominent candidate here is that Parker, by speaking for the marketplace, was acting purely on behalf of Elvis's fans, the King's customers. Consider Elvis's market-orientated career management. Back in the 1950s, the star said it was foolish to try something new if he was pleasing his audiences. So music commentator Dave Marsh blamed fans for stifling and their stifling loyalty. The 1960s were supposedly Presley's, and it's quote Groucho Marcus, "I walked like a zombie" phase, where under contract to MGM and other studios, the Memphis singer drifted through countless formula films and would have been, in the words of Alan Fortas, better off dead if he'd have wanted to become a serious actor. With a poor choice of songs to record for soundtracks, Elvis was, another quote, embalmed in celluloid on planet Hollywood. Making good-humoured family pictures where he almost invariably sang, the star was obliged to serve his fans. They only wanted to see him in musicals, and this idea itself represents a kind of unmasking which blames audience complicity for the star's descent. In such a formulation, Parker becomes a kind of necessary alibi, someone who affords Elvis's audience the opportunity to deny its role in working him into oblivion. The notion, however, raises the issue of who abused Elvis. It asks whether his audience was an insatiable force, he was an exploited cash cow, or maybe his audience might have thought of him as an unpredictably highly variable quantity. A critical problem here, however, is that the roller coaster strategy was not about the audience getting what it notionally wanted, Elvis at his creative and commercial centre, or simply exploiting demand until it was fully exhausted. What the roller coaster idea misses is that for survival, Presley and Parker decided to constantly shift media, music genres, locations, and audiences. In the end, Elvis was touring America's secondary markets, smaller interstitial locations, big towns and small cities. His recorded music career was by no means fully exhausted, yet his spirit was gone. Beyond the conception that Parker saw Elvis as only a cash resource is the idea that both men equally squandered the pots of income that they had secured. Elvis was never having a particular close eye on the money, and Parker purposefully neglected some areas of operation. Since agreements with RCA were negotiated, the largest royalty Elvis ever received was an abysmal 5 cents per record. Parker let the IRS figure out the star's taxes, and they frequently were overpaid. Elvis never collected publishing royalties on his 51 BMI songs, and RCA were not audited for their handle of his sales account. Memphis Mafia member Joe Esposito claimed that rather than the Colonel selling Elvis's entire back catalogue in 1973 because he wanted to, it was Elvis who demanded the sale and Parker who bargained up RCA. Even if this was the case, the singer only got $750,000 out of a $5 million and $5.5 million arrangement. One of the Colonel's specialties was to cut other parties out, always making it look like he took a larger percentage of Elvis's money. For example, Parker took 75% to 82% of Elvis's posthumous merchandising, a figure which seems outlandish. However, when Elvis first began licensing his image in the 1950s, income was split down the middle with organizer Hank Saperstein, and the Colonel simply moved in on Saperstein's territory when his contract ran out, becoming licensor, which together with the manager's fee created the result. Both the star and the manager squandered their respective money through bad deals and neglect. And Elvis owed the Colonel supposedly $1.5 million when he died. This led Presley's hairdresser, Larry Geller, to name his friend as one of the most mismanaged stars in history. The most famous celebrities could be seen rather like astronauts in that they go to places that other people go later. They are increasingly required to commodify aspects of themselves, including information, losing personal privacy, constantly being under surveillance, being entrepreneurial, brand aware, in competition, overworked and undermined by the market. However, specifically as neoliberal subjects, we have not succumbed to temptation, which is surely a biblical frame, but have rather been worked upon by ideologies, pointing to austerity but advocating entrepreneurialism. We've become globally dislocated in mechanisms of economic competition, and these have mined various resources, time, creativity, data, and eroded personal boundaries. Jeremy Gilbert has noted in relation to the state that neoliberal subjects seem to have been characterized by a constantly interventionist approach. Perhaps we are therefore not so much tempted as compelled into increasingly inhuman depths of self-commodification. In other words, rather than being enticed, we've been reshaped. In this sense, perhaps we can feel nostalgic about the human frailty of Elvis, even in his decline. Here, the Colonel exists in both his and Elvis's endgame as a kind of throwback to earlier times. The culture industry demands its front men and women give more of their identities to the public than other workers. In such circumstances, stars' bodies become their final property. In mythic narratives as a superstar, Elvis supposedly continued an inverted parent-child relationship with his father Vernon. As Vernon could not assert authority, Elvis tended to overindulge. Shock biographer Albert Goldman said that the Colonel's power increased as Elvis's declined, since Parker could use him to lever entertainment corporations. However, according to Presley, and this is one of Elvis's relatives, nobody restrained Elvis after Gladys died because his own father Vernon was too weak. It stands to reason that Parker was weak too. And after all, Parker ultimately failed to allow Presley's creativity and commerciality to merge in a way that would generate greater demand and keep his client happy. It appears later on that both Elvis and the Colonel seriously considered leaving each other. Furthermore, in the 1970s, as his charge put on weight and increasingly got into his drug prescriptions, the Colonel was even less in control. Rather than being an alibi or shield, what fans are left with in this scenario, in which an overreaching Parker becomes the abyss into which Elvis's talent was thrown, means, on the other hand, the Colonel's gambling pot got out of control as if to show that money had no meaning to him, and all his years of shrewdly getting the best deals were not about the revenue, they were about the con. This idea separates Parker from the corporate machinations of capital, but fails to place him above his working class roots. Dismissing the singer and the manager, the Washington Post ran a story that said, Parker and Presley represent the convergence of two characters from carnival culture, the poor boy who grabs the brass ring and the mysterious stranger who fleeces the innocent. Carnival culture was arguably used as a polite euphemism there for commercial desperation in the working class. If Elvis's father Vernon and the Colonel were twinned as inappropriate fathers in Elvis's myth, the one inadequate and the other exploitative, eventually the singer himself, his manager and his audience all, in a sense, became seen as the id, embodiments of a primitive, insatiable, addicted mind. Presley had his pills, Parker, now a permissive father, had his roulette wheel, and the fans had Elvis. Each could make use of the other, but as the 70s wore on, in the mass culture myth at least, none was quite enough to rescue an icon. Ironically, although Elvis was the most commodified person of his era, in such formulations he never quite got his due because he failed, in a contemporary sense, to embrace his position and entrepreneurially brand himself. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for those readings, and interesting affinities there between the Frankenstein novel and how we read the creator-creature relationship. So my first question is that the full title of your book is Scary Monsters, with the subtitle Monstrosity, Masculinity and Popular Music. I was wondering, to get things going, if you could explain the main critical term monstrosity and why the alignment between the monstrous and masculinities.
I think I'll kick off, and then Mark can add something afterwards if you want, Mark.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think it was Mark's idea originally to write a book on monstrosity and popular music, and so first of all, there didn't appear to be much out there specifically on that topic, especially when we initiated the book, and when you look into it, monstrosity is not a straightforward thing. So I think fairly quickly we realized that monstrosity can be taken on in quite a few different levels. First of all, it can be something that artists perform themselves. It can be something tied up with their own presentation, or it could be part of their lyrics, etc. But also, monsters have a long tradition. So, people, there are certain very prevalent cultural myths that both going back to ancient times, but also in kind of as dominant myths in our culture, such as Frankenstein and the Phantom of the Opera, that appear across lots of different media, and that are available as a kind of a repertoire for performers to tap into thematically, or as a shorthand, a cultural shorthand. But also when you look into monstrosity, one of the things that people say is that we've almost had a kind of a secularization of the monster. So it's moved from being a kind of a mythical, archetypal thing to something which is the province of, first of all, natural science, in things like teratology, the kind of the study of monsters, but also the criminological monster, the way that the dominant monsters of our time might be the subject of true crime media, as opposed to kind of archetypal myths and so on. So when you bring all this into the mix, it becomes sort of very complicated. You can also say that monsters are discursive constructs. If you go from if you take certain perspectives on it, you'll find various post-structuralist ideas that various discourses talk about monsters and construct them for various reasons, perhaps in relation to power, or perhaps in relation to the psyche, or what have you, and sometimes that's relevant. So when we started to write the book, or in fact when we were nearing completion of the book, I was really struck by the way in which Mark and I had almost independently used some of these varying types of monstrosity in our analysis. So we both we both referenced key kind of examples such as Frankenstein and the Phantom of the Opera. We both kind of used monstrosity to explore other aspects of identity, notably obviously masculinity, but also race and ethnicity in various chapters. And then we'd also written chapters which were accounts of kind of particular toxic and in fact kind of predatory types of masculinity, and we'd almost come upon those, I'd say, semi-independently, given the brief of what monstrosity could be. it played out in these incredibly wide-ranging ways across our case studies. But there were interesting echoes in across our 2 chapters, I think. I should hand over to Mark now.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all those things you've said there, John. I think my conception of the book started when I was at the conference, The Monster Inside Us, the Monster Around Us, Monstrosity and Humanity in November 2011 in Leicester, which is where I'd met Scott. From that, I'd been teaching a bit on horror cinema, and I realised that there were a lot of different interesting theoretical elements to monstrosity, and that it was a subject that was sort of taking off in the humanities at that point. And so there was a lot of material there of theoretical interest. And then I thought, well, why are so few people talking about monstrosity in relation to popular music? So that's kind of how it came about. And I worked with John because I think I had about half a book's worth of stuff that actually, when John came on board, he actually brought in topics and ideas I would never have thought of, and addressed them in really interesting ways. And so it really strengthened what the book could be about. But I suppose for me, the most simple ideas of monster are this kind of, projection of evil, or a kind of the notion of the inhumanly cruel person, and there's a sort of slippage between those two things. But also in relation to monstrosity, another thing I'd say is that monsters can be interesting because they kind of can oscillate between figures of horror and projected figures of horror and subjects of pity. So there's actually a lot to talk about when you think about the idea of monstrosity, and I think we've made a good first stab of sort of bringing some of that discussion into the realm of popular music, as other people have begun to as well.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. You perhaps touched on this already. In your introduction, you refer to a variety of masculinities. What varieties does your book focus on, thinking about those themes, those gothic and horror themes that you explore?
Do you want to go first, Mark, or shall I?
I think you can go first. Yeah, I'm happy for that.
Okay, well, one of the jobs in the book was to talk about some sort of theories of masculinity, and so on. And so the way that I would usually talk to students about masculinity is that it's part, the academic attention to masculinity is largely a product of feminism, I would say. So, in other words, in the same way has happened with whiteness, masculinity has was almost the default option and appeared to be invisible. So I think that feminism's kind of some of the important works of feminism turned the lens on masculinity, and exposed it as not the invisible default option, but something that is itself a constructed thing. I'd say that I did an undergraduate lecture on masculinity at the start of this week, and one of the things I think that you have to do these days is to try to prevent the equation of masculinity with toxic masculinity. Do you know what I mean? It becomes all too easy to say, well, masculinity is all of these bad and unpleasant things, and I think that in writing a book like this, there's a temptation to allow those versions of masculinity to dominate, and it wouldn't be surprising if they do. But I think that it's one of the attractions of writing on something like glam rock is that it can also become a playful, and perhaps it can allow for subordinate masculinities also to be expressed. And I think that's a pattern in the book, although there are some egregious examples of toxic masculinity in popular music culture, and it's worth talking about those certainly. And you can then key that into various ideas of like Raewyn Connell's ideas about hegemonic masculinity, which have been really influential and important. But Mark was able to also kind of reference and bring to my attention some very recent studies which have talk about performances of masculinity that perhaps escape or break with some of those more traditional masculinities. So I think the book was a combination of trying to look at some monstrous examples of masculinity which will veer towards the toxic at certain points, but also to try and explore versions which are more playful, less problematic, where you can identify them.
Okay, thank you. Mark, do you want to say anything?
I think John said it all there really well, and I don't think there's very much to add to that. I mean, as John was talking, I got to think about maybe the theoretical complexity of attempting to untangle kind of masculinity and patriarchy. We could say patriarchy is a sort of unequal power relationship which masculinity underwrites, but of course there's not, as John said, there's not one masculinity. There are different masculinities at different times that are demanded by the economy, and there's also a variety of people's behaviors within that, some of which are marginalized, and as we've seen in recent times, gender has been sort of challenged and shifted in all sorts of different ways, and so there's not kind of one thing. But as we were planning the book, it was interesting that perhaps because of the conversation about toxic masculinity, nearly all the examples we could think of were male, and that was interesting given that other books have been written about the way that femininity has been demonized. I mean, Barbara Creed's work is a sort of good example of this. So it kind of it was the different elements kind of came together as we were kind of putting this thing together, and it seemed appropriate and sensible to think about it in relation to masculinity.
Okay, thank you very much. So my next question is, why does your book begin with an examination of the 1909 popular story, The Phantom of the Opera, and how does this relate to your general views of popular music?
Well, I can take that one because that was my chapter. The book begins with that, well, not just because it's a very early example of a prominent notion of monstrosity in relation to masculinity, but also in popular music. But also, if you think about it, it's then kind of continually circulated in various ways. I mean, it's not just Phantom of the Opera. You had things like Phantom of the Paradise in the 1970s and other reversions of it, and Andrew Lloyd Webber's version. And so it struck me that there was this sort of fictional urtext, almost, if you like, of monstrosity and popular music that seemed to sort of resonate historically and sort of demonstrate that the two were not coincidental, that actually they had been joined in various ways in prominent representations. And then the orientation of that chapter was really to think about Phantom of the Opera in relation to sound recordings. So there was this idea of when you think of when Phantom of the Opera was written and the culture at the time, opera singers were huge stars. You had people like Enrico Caruso. Some of their fans were kind of talked about in negative ways. And once I started to think about the issue of sound recording, because of course these stars were putting their work out on records, and sound recording was relatively new historically. I started to read Phantom of the Opera in relation to sound recording and was quite excited because I realized there were connections, and you had this idea of the voice coming from the box being the kind of richer person's enclosure in the opera house, but also this being a kind of metaphor almost for the gramophone, and sound recording technologies associated with it that would play voices that seemed to come out of thin air from nowhere. And so you had this kind of idea of spectrality kind of coming in, which sort of appears quite a lot in Phantom of the Opera, that I could then discuss. And then once I'd kind of established that, I kind of started to think, well, how in relation to how the music industry developed after that, can we read the updates of Phantom of the Opera in relation to kind of changes in the industry? So for example, you know, some of the later versions, film versions of Phantom of the Opera seem to be more about kind of disenfranchised composers, which is not really something that was in the original story. So there's a sort of a reworking of kind of who the monster is and why they're positioned that way and how we should feel about them, that come through the different versions of the story.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So my next question, I believe you also wrote this chapter. I suppose one of the most revealing chapters is on Leadbelly and the parallels to the racial themes in the 1933 film King Kong. Perhaps you could give some insight into how this relates to your underlying concept of monsters in popular music, and also how Leadbelly was positioned as King Kong.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I had to be very careful in writing this chapter because I didn't want to appear racist or kind of monstrosizing Leadbelly. What I wanted to do was consider the fact that Leadbelly had been kind of paraded around New York in the light, in the kind of context of these representations of monstrosity like King Kong, which clearly to some degree referenced race already. And you had this idea of the monster coming to the city as a kind of exotic specimen and going on a rampage. Now, well, Leadbelly was sort of classified in relation to his race, but also in relation to his criminality. And the Lomax's conception was that he wanted to find music that was made furthest away from the media. So you had this kind of conception of modernity and primitivism built into Lomax's quest. And then when he picked Leadbelly and took him to New York, I kind of thought, well, all of this is very interesting in the context of race relations in this period, and you're not long after the Harlem Renaissance and the idea of what they called the new Negro, and so you could see some parallels here, that there was a kind of anxiety over race, that the way that Leadbelly was treated was kind of in tune with, if you like. But at the end of the chapter, I also say we need to watch out a little bit in terms of making these readings or assuming these kind of that somebody like Lomax is a monster for sort of being racist, because of course there's some other things to talk about. One is that society is different at different points, but another thing is that also we're like, as Cornel West has said, we all have some kind of residual racism in us, and so with like some of these representations, you get to kind of Eric Lott's idea that I mean, he's talking about love and theft, but like the idea that there's cross currents and complexities in these attachments, and that there can be positive things in there as well as negative, and so that's why I wanted to explore in the chapter.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is to you again. I know you're an expert on Elvis Presley, and so the following chapter is on Colonel Parker and the manager as a monster. Many viewers, as you will know, will be familiar with the recent Elvis film directed by Baz Luhrmann, which depicts Presley's talents as being financially exploited by his manager, Colonel Parker. Do you see a wider parallel here in terms of the commodification of artists or performers in the business of popular culture? And how do your views tally or not with the film's depiction of Colonel Parker?
Oh, that's quite a lot of questions there, Scott. I'll try to.
So the first question is, do you see parallels in terms of the commodification of artists in popular music, and how do your views in terms of this chapter relate to the film?
I think I obviously, as I was discussing in the bit that I read out, certainly it appears clear that Parker overreached, and there were negative things about how he took money off his client. But I think as well, there's more complexity there than we think, and I discussed some of that. What interested me was more that, in relation to Parker, there is this perception of him as the sort of the bad father coming in and kind of exploiting a young person whose family is poorly bonded in some ways, and who, although there's huge amounts of love, that there was his father disappears into prison when he's a young person because he's forged a check, and so a young Elvis kind of bonds a lot with his mother, and he's very close to his mother. So I was interested in that sort of idea of the ogreous bad father kind of coming in, because I think in conceptions of Parker, there's a lot of talk about how kind of like negative and evil he is, and those are also linked to conceptions of class, which is why I talked about the idea of the carnival there. But it kind of that was the emphasis of the chapter, and the thing that kind of fascinated me was that kind of set of linkages, and I think they were sort of symbolized in this idea of that Parker was an immigrant from Holland, which was kind of kept secret, and we know that that's true. But there was also this idea that he could have escaped Holland because he committed a murder, and we have no clear evidence that that is actually the case, and it's a sort of Parker conspiracy theory. So I was interested in, like, given that people are sort of making up those kind of myths, what does that say? And actually, since I've written that chapter, that it sort of made me think about all sorts of other music managers. And obviously there's ones in the 1960s. I mean, Don Arden would be a good example of this, that, are sort of positioned as thugs or kind of, bad people. But actually, you go back, and Louis Armstrong's manager was supposedly connected with the mob, and so there's a sort of long-term sort of idea that these managers kind of come out of sort of seedy places or negative places because there's enough money to be made that sharks appear, kind of thing. So yeah, that chapter's about that. And what was the second part of your?
So I suppose what I'm saying is, do you think the Baz Luhrmann depiction of Colonel Parker continues that constructed image of the manager as a monster? I mean, does it really problematize that relationship in the way that you do?
I'd give a mixed answer to that. I think that the film claims to be from Parker's perspective, but you can kind of see Parker kind of overreaching a bit in the film. But actually, in some other ways, the film's kind of quite sympathetic to Parker, and it makes Elvis look like, Parker's got a problem here because the guy that he's handling is a kind of has gone astray. So I think it's a bit more complicated than Parker just being a kind of evil figure who's excusing himself in the film. I mean, the film claims to be from his perspective, but it gives a mixed view of the idea. And he doesn't come across 100% as a monster, I don't think, in the Luhrmann film, but it's interesting. One of the interesting things about that film is the bit early on in the film where Elvis goes to a juke joint as a small child and sort of peers in and sees Big Boy Crudup playing a song, and the sort of celebration and sensual abandonment associated with that, and that kind of inspires him to become a rock and roll performer. That's the thing in Luhrmann's kind of story of it. But then later on in the film, when Elvis is this sort of tempestuous rock and roll performer, Colonel Parker kind of peaks. There's a point where Colonel Parker kind of peaks and looks at him kind of like across a stage, which kind of reproduces that image. And so, there's maybe sort of connections made there that may be a little bit more complicated than just, well, this guy's cold, calculating shark who just appears and sort of takes over.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is to John, and your chapter is entitled "The Platform Prometheus, Frankenstein and Glam Rock," and you gave reading of that earlier, you gave reading of an extract. So my question to you is, as you know, the Frankenstein novel has generated a Frankenstein myth with numerous tropes and readings, and you focus on notable affinities with the idea of bricolage in Dick Hebridge's account of style in musical subcultures, and the creature as composed of dead bits and bobs. Perhaps you could elaborate on those affinities for us.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, possibly the Frankenstein idea pops into my head first when I was preparing the book. I mean, you know, it's just probably entirely predictable that one of us would have wanted to pick this one up. And like the Phantom of the Opera, it's one of these cultural myths and archetypes that keeps cropping up. And I think the point about Frankenstein as an intellectual property is it's always mutating and branching off and accruing new baggage and ditching other things. So, and this happens across different media, you know, as Jack Halberstam points out. And so it you know, it moves from page to stage, and then from stage to screen, and then to popular music. And every time it does so, it kind of, you know, it becomes a new hybrid entity. It becomes it takes on new aspects and so on. And so it becomes, each time it's fashioned anew as a new hybrid and a new construct. And I think that that in very productive ways, I would say, in popular music. So I think that it's kind of used, it's used creatively as and adopted by music performers to you know, so that in their performance of identity. So glam rock is a kind of a classic place where that happens, and there are lots of glam rock performers who either allude to or were described as or feature in their lyrics Frankenstein. I mean, there's the New York Dolls track Frankenstein, which you know, which was one of the, probably the first track that I thought of, and it's probably not the most typical one, but you know, performers like Alice Cooper were described as you know, in Frankensteinian terms. But also it freed up performances of identity to include aspects like a play with gender. I think, you know, I think this is the most probably optimistic chapter for constructors of masculinity that I wrote in the book, in that, you know, that this type of glam rock's ability to mix and match and to compose new identities, I think provided a liberating avenues for performers, you know, to play with gender, from Mark Bolan to David Bowie, perhaps within certain circumscribed limits. But also, you know, if we extend the definition of glam rock to include, you know, as some scholars have done, bands like, you know, Parliament and Funkadelic and so on, then, you know, it allows you to add other aspects of identity into the mix, as well as gender, such as race and ethnicity or cultural identity. So that's the sense in which I think bricolage takes place, both at the level of performers constructing their own identities, but also because you know, glam rock is a mix and match. In some ways, it's going back to the 1950s again, because it's, you know, that there was an interest in rock and roll and rockabilly, and there was a return to the 7-inch single format. So it you know, Simon Reynolds says that glam rock's one of the first kind of postmodernist types of music. It's one of the first backward-looking mix and match bricolage forms of popular music. And you know, whether or not you buy that, the bricolage and DIY aspect of glam rock seems incontrovertible. I mean, if you think of Roxy Music, you've got Brian Ferry kind of almost going back to a crooner, or almost Noel Coward vocal delivery, but it's combined with Brian Eno's almost krautrock style innovations, and then, you know, Mackay and Manzanera's kind of quite rocky and rock and roll styles. And you know, I've just given you one example. You could do that for any number of other performers. You can think of the way that David Bowie was continually developing these new personae and so on. I hope that answer makes sense.
No, that's a great response. Yeah, thank you very much. So back to you, Mark. Chapter 5 is on Mark Chapman, the Christian fundamentalist who murdered John Lennon in 1980, and the relation to notions of fandom. For other scholars, for instance, Terry Eagleton, you touched on this early on, the idea of the monstrous becomes quite a nebulous term, but also relates to ideas of evil. In his book on evil, the monstrous can mean an unredeemable act beyond the pale. With this in mind, perhaps I can address the same question you pose to your readers. So this is the question you leave your readers with at the end of this chapter. Was Chapman's act so monstrous that we should effectively therefore choose to say there was no subject there who actually did it. So why did you pose that question, and what's your response to that question?
Well, let me take a few of the things you were saying there, Scott. I mean, I'll kind of answer in a roundabout way, if I may.
Okay.
I started the chapter by mentioning that monstrosity could equate to kind of has been equated to acts that are kind of exceptional or kind of beyond the pale. And of course, the shooting of John Lennon is widely seen as and I think rightly seen as one of those acts. Now, the question that many people ask is why on earth did this happen? You know, the sort of a nihilistic kind of aspect of this crime seems overwhelming to people, and what they sometimes forget is that I mean, you said about Chapman being a fundamentalist Christian, which he may have become, but I know that he went through all sorts of religious variants. And he hadn't actually been a Beatles fan for about 10 years when he shot John Lennon. He'd been a Beatles fan a lot earlier, and he was posing as a fan to get closer to Lennon. So why did he do it? Well, he did it because he was mentally ill, and you can't, if somebody's got a mental illness, you can't necessarily impute a kind of legitimate reasoned motive to what they do, and people can cope with that sort of idea. So they kind of drummed up this conception, in my view, that he was a kind of deranged fan who had sort of gone down the slippery slope of low self-esteem, and then believing that Lennon was a hypocrite, and then that Lennon had all this power and wealth and he didn't, and therefore because of Lenin's inauthenticity he should shoot him. Well, yeah, you can look at Chapman's story and make up aspects that kind of fit that, or kind of find evidence to fit that theory. But actually, I think it was the other way around. I think Chapman was significantly mentally ill, and it was one of these things. I mean, John Corky wrote about this crime and others, and he said, well, in the world of the mental illness, it's the same as the rest of us. Mentally unstable people have celebrities in their heads like the rest of us do. So, the fact that he went on this kind of mission, I don't think could be equated to a sort of thing that was either reasoned or could necessarily be easily explained with reason. So that's one side of it. And then I also think that Chapman, when he was captured, was in a state of dissociation. And eventually he began coming out of that state dissociation because he's not 100% mentally challenged. His faculties oscillate, if you like. When he kind of started to think how he could explain what he did, I think that he picked up on these discourses that were circulating about fandom and that was imputing of the crime as happening in this way, and kind of went with them and kind of used them in part to develop his own celebrity. Because so he was on even though he was in prison, he was on Larry King and other kind of media channels talking about the crime. In retrospect, as a person who almost kind of witnessed himself doing it, he was like the nearest person, and of course, he did it, but there was a sense that he couldn't, he had to cognate his own responsibility for it. And then on top of that, there was then a reading that was, I could understand why it's made by Yoko Ono and Paul McCartney and other people that got to a point of almost saying, this is a New York crime. There's no the reason that John Lennon was killed was not that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that he was being put up in society, was sort of subject to a moment of literally a moment of madness. But it was rather that he was living in a dangerous place, New York, and so almost the anonymous energies of New York overwhelmed him. Well, I don't think that that's true. I mean, I think that Chapman wasn't a New York resident. He came to New York to do the crime, and you can see why that reading is made, because it puts all of the attention back onto John Lennon, which many people do and want to do. And so I could understand that. And then I suppose my final thing was to say that, look, the part of the reason that the media discussion has happened around this crime was that it allows the media to then go back to that image of fandom as this kind of Dionysian kind of torrent, because there's a sort of discussion about how, if these fans ever get hold of Chapman, they're going to tear him limb from limb because they're so enraged by the crime. And so there's a sort of sense in which they then become sort of positioned as monstrous themselves, and this is an alibi for keeping Chapman in prison for his own good. I wanted to kind of unpack and explore all of that, and I think this idea of the crime that is so beyond the pale that it's kind of exceptional allowed me to sort of get a window into that sort of set of concerns. Yeah. Does that begin to answer your question? I didn't want to necessarily come down morally and say, well, this reading is the correct one, and I don't want to go along with this reading. I wanted to sort of think about those different readings and think, well, why are they being made?
Well, we'll perhaps come back to that when we look at the last chapter. So, John, in your chapter, you return to Gothic and horror themes in relation to hip-hop, the hip-hop band Gravediggaz, with particular focus on the undead. There's a fascinating short section on Gothic Marxism. What do you mean by this, and how do you apply this concept?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm putting two things together, which might seem as though they don't initially belong together, but quite a few people have noted the Gothic vocabulary that Marx and Engels use. I mean, that's nothing really original in me mentioning the equation of capital with vampires, which is there a lot. But I mean, if you, in the Communist Manifesto, there's, it opens with the words, a spectre is haunting Europe, and it refers to capitalism creating its own grave diggers. So first of all, various people have identified Gothic vocabulary in Marx's own works, and then the point was, I suppose this would be a way in which in a chapter you could combine attention to sort of Gothic self-presentation of various recording artists with an attention to perhaps political economy and capital and so on. So in this chapter, I mean, I start off the chapter by saying that a few in the years before I started writing on this topic, which is about 10 years ago, there was a vogue for Gothic imagery and themes in hip hop music, and people were saying, what's this new trend? And it just made me think back to the 90s, when there was this horrorcore moment in hip hop, when various groups started to, calling your group Gravediggaz is already one kind of indication of that, but there were Bone Thugs and Harmony and Flatliners as well, and various other artists would adopt kind of horror themes and so on. So I thought it would be interesting to explore that stuff. I was quite influenced also by a book by Marcus Reeves called Somebody Scream, which was a book about the legacy of, if you like, Black Power in rap music, and he presents a really interesting narrative where there's a moment perhaps in the 1980s which is the high point of Black Power and to an extent Black Muslim sort of imagery in hip hop music, associated with maybe Eric B. and Rakim and Public Enemy, artists like that. And then he says that around the end of that decade, it falls from that kind of discourse falls from grace in the music for a couple of reasons. One, some of the artists get into trouble. Professor Griff, who was a member of Public Enemy, was involved in an anti-Semitism scandal after an interview. But also, and so some, Public Enemy found themselves kind of, in hot water, I think, politically and so on. But also there was the rise of groups like NWA, who brought in a much more gangster rap kind of style of lyric, which was at odds to some extent with the more kind of radical type of political themes that were in the earlier music. And so I kind of, my thesis is basically that some of the concerns which were articulated in more explicitly political ways in 80s hip hop becomes, if you like, put into a supernatural vocabulary instead in some of these horrorcore bands. It's almost like they being talking in openly, or well, in straightforwardly political terms, becomes replaced instead by some kind of allegorical treatment in a horror style instead. I hope that makes sense. There's some interesting kind of horror hip hop films around the time. There's Bones with Snoop Dogg, and then there's there are other films like that where artists become interested in the I suppose the fun you can have with horror, but also the way that horror and gothic can be used to express kind of political concerns. I mean, I was able to mention Jordan Peele, who had become kind of famous with his cinema towards the tail end of writing this book. And I think it's a similar thing there, that horror and a world of gothic themes, whatever that, then supernatural can be used as a kind of a sort of a folksy way. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, in a kind of a mythical or folk tale kind of a way of addressing concerns which you might want to address indirectly instead of directly, for whatever reason. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. It seems to be suggesting that they're using the language of Gothic to some ways in their own indirect Marxist way critique the very thing that they've become in terms of the commodification of music and what music stands for. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, there's also, I won't explain this term at length, but there's a book which which really struck me when I read it, by Cedric Robinson, called Black Marxism. And so he explores the kind of, the occasionally thorny relationship between African American and Black academics and Marxism. And Cedric Robinson introduces this really important term, racial capitalism, which has been elaborated on by various other thinkers. I mean, in this country, Gargi Bhattacharya wrote a book on it recently, for instance. And I think hip hop artists are very often complaining about the music industry and their commodification, or they're having to negotiate their own commodification. And sometimes I think that Gothic vocabulary is a way of talking about various economic inequalities and social inequalities, but it's also a way of figuring the music industry as a place full of of manipulative monsters and snakes and that kind of a language. Yeah,
thanks. Sticking you, John, the title for chapter 7 is Masculinity on Trial, Noir Désir and Perverse Narcissism. Could you unpack this title, please?
Yeah, that's a very reasonable question, I think. Yeah, I mean, the perverse narcissism stuff is probably the thing that needs some explanation. And I suppose I'm taking some largely psychoanalytic ideas there. So, I'm not going to give you an exhaustive definition of those terms, but narcissism is, well, I think it's used fairly widely in I think in psychiatry and in psychoanalysis to talk about a certain type of relation to the self which might become problematic. So I think people talk about narcissism as slightly loosely, or in various contexts, as being a problematic character type. A bit like Machiavellianism, according to as I understand it, a non-psychoanalytic model, there's a triad of dark personality types, of which narcissism is one, and that will be a kind of a self-obsessed, preening kind of sort of person, I think, who's only concerned with themselves. In Freudian psychoanalysis, and again, I won't go into great detail here, narcissism is something that we all go through. So at some stage, we all take ourselves to be, our own erotic objects, but also the foundations of our sense of self and our sense of what other people are as well. But in this chapter, I'm taking I'm using narcissism in the looser sense of somebody who exhibits various kind of self-centered manipulative behaviors. And that's also the way in which I'm using this word perverse. Analysts use perversion to mean a kind of again a fairly manipulative, abusive relation to the other, in which the will and the others are used instrumentally, effectively. And so in the chapter I talk about one particular French writer who called Irigoyen, and she has a book on perverse narcissism. And not only does this present a model of a kind of a toxic manipulative individual, which is rather close to the behavior which it seems to be exhibited by the lead singer of Noir Désir in this chapter, but also she became involved in the media discourse about the singer Bertrand Cantat in the French media. So I hope this makes sense. Noir Désir is a French band, and famously the lead singer of the band was imprisoned for manslaughter because he beat his girlfriend, who was quite a big star, a French actress, to death in a notorious kind of episode, at the start of this millennium, really. What I was interested in the chapter, not only because obviously this is provides a kind of a type of behavior which seems to be monstrous in some fairly fundamental level, but also the way that the media talked about this episode brought in these frameworks about perverse narcissism. And in fact, people would go on French television who knew the victim and the victim's family, and they had read this book about perverse narcissism, and they would use that very concept actually in their interview. Do you see what I mean? So it's an interesting moment when a kind of a theoretical view about a personality disorder becomes part of the media discourse about a musical star. So my attention in the chapter is really looking at the way the media sometimes uses this type of vocabulary. They also, there was lots of monstrous vocabulary which would seep in. At one point, the police describes the character as a Jekyll and Hyde, Cantat as a Jekyll and Hyde character, and people in the interviews would sometimes refer to the victim in monstrous terms as well. There was almost like, and so it's masculinity on trial, because the singer of the band clearly seems to represent a certain type of toxic masculinity, which in other contexts we might refer to as coercive control. That, I believe, is the dominant term these days, or a domestic abuser, which is a fairly straightforwardly negative type of masculinity. But this singer was literally on trial in Vilnius, where the event took place. And both his accusers and his defenders were present in the media, bringing out this type of semi-psychoanalytic vocabulary, as well as a vocabulary of monstrosity, to describe what his crime and what he'd done. Have I answered all the bits of your question?
We're going to talk about perverse narcissism at the very end. So we'll come back to it. Yeah, thanks for that. So back to you, Mark. You end the book on Jimmy Savile, someone you refer to as a jingle jangle man. In this chapter, I would say the tone is certainly morally assertive, and this distinctively contrasts with your chapter on Mark Chapman. Why end on Jimmy Savile, and how does Jimmy Savile relate to the Gothic themes and the notion of music as monstrous cultural capital that you previously explored in the book?
I think we ended the book on Jimmy Savile because he is like the book was sort of came out of a conference in 2011, so it kind of emerged at a time where there was a lot of discussion about Jimmy Savile in the media, and after he died, and these allegations had come to light about the industrial scale on which he had sexually assaulted people, and it seemed to be appropriate that that in some ways the book follows chronology and in some ways it doesn't. But I think we started on a chapter that was early in time, and we were finishing it on a much more recent case. I think maybe readers in America might be less familiar with Jimmy Savile. I think everybody in Britain would know about his story. What I was doing in the chapter was thinking about, generally speaking, in the book, that most of the people we were looking at, all the people we looked at, I think, had been called monsters by the press in different ways, or there was sort of monstrosity had been attached to them. I think I suppose that always raises the question of whether that label is justified. And I think in Savile's case, yes, he'd psychologically damaged large numbers of people, and that was beyond a doubt. And in that sense, perhaps I was on slightly more firm ground to discuss him as a monster. I think the way I pursued it was, first of all, by talking about some of the reports that had come out of the different institutions and how they'd kind of, in my view, to some degree, kind of sort of exonerated themselves almost from what happened, although that's open to debate. But once I started looking into Savile's case, specifically from a popular music angle, because the book's about popular music, what became clear was that Savile himself had played on this notion of the music industry as a sort of place of sharks and snakes, as the word John used. And I think that, in a sense, there had been a sort of popular orientalizing of the music industry. In other words, we'd sort of, to some degree, placed our fears and our desires in this sort of netherworld of kind of seedy characters and unsavory dealings. And Savile kind of knew that and kind of played upon it as part of his public persona. So then I thought, well, how could you discuss that and think about it? And so that got me to the idea that, first of all, Savile came through in the post-war years, and in a sense, this is a time of the consumer boom and the rise of the teenager and the economy kind of going into overdrive in relation to consumption. And Savile had this sort of notion of being the jingle jangle man, a kind of flashy figure, but at the same time, you could also read him as a spiv, which is a sort of British archetype of the person who's manipulative insofar that they'll do a trade with you and they'll get you something you want, but also they'll take something from you. And so I was interested in Savile kind of occupying these roles to pursue his case. And that got me to think about how maybe he obviously had a friendship, and perhaps a reluctant friendship, with Mrs. Thatcher, and that is something else we deal with, the sort of question of whether Savile was sort of somehow connected with what people are calling the deep state or not. And I don't. It's almost like the connections go so far, and then we can't see if they go any further if they do. But so I think that maybe is not a productive line. And equally, the sort of some of the myths about Savile, like he was a Satanist or whatever, you can kind of begin exploring them, but actually they kind of turn what he did into entertainment itself, and so they're kind of questionable and kind of unproven. So in the end, it kind of, I was kind of intrigued by this idea that basically he'd kind of used this conception of the music industry to kind of exploit his audience. Yeah, but that tell me your question again so that I can see if I've pinned it.
No, you have, in terms of why you're more morally assertive.
Right.
I suppose you have touched on how Jimmy Savile relates to the Gothic themes and notion music as monstrous cultural capital. But perhaps let's go to the next question, the last question.
Okay.
And that'd be a good way of kind of, in some ways, wrapping up and bringing some of those ideas in. So this is, John wrote the introduction, but the question goes to both you. So let's go back to the introduction. You say the case studies focus on male monsters, both fictitious and real, and you've talked about, as you see it, as a real example of the monsters in terms of Jimmy Savile. You also say that attention to monstrosity is a fruitful way to approach the study of masculinity in popular music. So my question is, do you think there are, because you give a quite like Gothic, monstrous view of popular music, and I can see where you're coming from, but do you think there are alternate, to use American alternate example? Let's start that question again. Do you think there are alternate masculinities in popular music culture that counter your notions of masculinity? Or does the fictitious point to a prevalent reality in popular music, given the intrinsic nature of the business? And for instance, you've touched on many Freudian concepts such as the Oedipal complex and narcissism, and we can think of many now contemporary examples in terms of perverse narcissism and that monstrous relationship between managers and the cultural capital of music business.
Who wants to go first on that?
First?
I don't mind. If you want to go first, John,
I mean, the first thing I'd say is that yes, I think there would be other types of masculinity there. I mean, this isn't something that's based on case studies. I think is often not aiming to be kind of exhaustive and universal and so on. And I think that the way I'd see it, I mean, that there's you could do a Venn diagram, couldn't you? You could do with monstrosity and masculinity in popular music, and then there's a bit that this book is hitting, but there'd be plenty in the circles which weren't overlapping with the other circles, and which would be other expressions of all of these things. I think there would be non-Gothic expressions of masculinity in popular music culture, and non-monstrous types of masculinity, but there was sufficient. It was there in sufficient quantity for it to be an interesting kind of overlap. I think, as I said earlier, sometimes conversations on masculinity very quickly reach the toxic, and when you get to toxic masculinity, it is often evoked in fairly horrific terms, whether that's a kind of supernatural horror or a kind of more everyday kind of secular type of horror, the horror of manipulative and nasty expressions of masculinity, and so I think it's fairly fruitful territory, but I wouldn't say that it exhausts in any way all expressions of masculinity. I'd say that lots people like Philip Auslander and so on have directed attention to the performative nature of kind of constructing identity in music, and Gothic is a really kind of fruitful and fun way of artists to express themselves. I mean, we didn't talk about kind of various kind of metal bands or black metal bands that use lots of stage makeup, and we didn't pick some other kind of really obvious kind of examples that we might do, but there is some relation between kind of horror and Gothic, and perhaps the flamboyance of some self-presentation styles. I think people who are associated with dressing up on stage very quickly move towards various types of things that could be construed as monstrous, but in positive ways as well as negative ways. I mean, the way in which David Bowie was likened to an alien, it is very different to the kind of the almost zombie or vampire like undead look that some metal bands go for when they make themselves up on stage or whatever it might be. But when you have a musical form which is very reliant on on dressing up and constructing identity through cosmetics, makeup, costume, and stuff like that, then perhaps it does lend itself to a gothic treatment for quite a few performers.
Yeah, I'd very much agree with a lot of the things John has said there. I think that the that idea of the Venn diagram is interesting, because I also think, to some degree, maybe the media also focus on this sort of center of the Venn diagram as much as anything else. But of course, the book is about exploring those particular connections. It's not attempting to blanket the whole of masculinity or the whole of popular music in those different ways. And actually, if you look at popular music history, I think it's been a forum to play with gender a lot and to sort of push the envelope and to sort of change what people accept about gender, and that can only be a positive thing. But I think the sort of deeper question behind that is, given that gender relations, patriarchy are about these unequal power relations, is it ever possible to be positive within inequality? And I think that's a tougher one to answer, because in a sense, one answer is yes, because if you're compassionate and responsible within those unequal power relations, then you can do good. So you're kind of doing something that's been given to you. But the opposite answer would be no. If there's any inequality there, then the roles must be negative. Now, whether they're monstrous, and we go as far as that, is another question. And of course, finally, there's, I suppose, the sort of Christian notion that we're all sinners in some form. Now, whether that sort of reaches to monstrosity is another person's guess. But I don't. I think realistically, the summary would be that this book isn't about all of masculinity, and it's not about all of popular music. It's about this beginning to explore this intersection of these different aspects.
And it's interesting because I think of many examples of people who've led so-called clean lives, who seem to be virtuous, and they often get parodied or things like Paul McCartney, etc., because we don't have that kind of monstrous rock and roll persona. And yet, when we talk about the rock and roll star, it often means or alludes to something that's kind of monstrous. I suppose in some ways, what I'm trying to suggest is almost as if performers have to live up to this ideal. There's a kind of monstrous ideal within popular culture, or you're simply someone like Val Doonican, who's
Well, are you conflating monstrosity there with rebellion? Because could you be rebellious and responsible, or rebellious and non-monstrous? Maybe.
Probably rebellion in a performative way, isn't it? Because you could think of the shifting politics of music industry, and it's become in some ways more apolitical in terms of mainstream music, whereas it has become more subcultural, I would argue. Was that fair?
And I think you're also, by implication, what you're also bringing out is that, one person's monstrosity is not another person's monstrosity, and so for some people, all popular music, well, vast swathes of popular music would be the music of the devil, and of course, for vast swathes of other people, that certainly wouldn't be the case. So I think that monstrosity is in the eye of the beholder to an extent, or there's a variation in the way that these artists will be received by their audiences in monstrous terms or otherwise, and then of course there's the appeal of monstrosity. Perhaps the appeal of rock and roll music seemed monstrous to I don't know, people in in the late 50s, early 60s or whatever, whereas that monstrosity or that perceived darkness or rebelliousness was the appeal for other members of the audience. I mean, Mark's right. Rebelliousness is not identical to monstrosity, but for certain sections of the audience, I think it might be.
But do you think there is an emphasis on perverse narcissism, or that narcissism becomes perverse within popular music culture. You think about.
I'll try and answer very briefly, and then allow Mark to add something if he wants. I mean, I think popular music should encourage narcissism. You know, I think that's not in and of itself harmful. That I think that putting yourself up on the stage and inviting an audience to behold you, you know, if I think that there's a certain operational narcissism that would be almost essential for that relationship to work. You know, and if you take a Freudian position, everybody has some narcissistic kind of component to them. So I think it and narcissism is also the basis on which we construct our idea of other selves. So I think that we might say that you know, audiences could enjoy the narcissistic performance of an artist that they like, but that could also be part of the basis of their own identity construction. It could be something productive for them. Do you see what I mean? They can behold the you know, that an artist that they particularly admire, and that could open up various things for their own sense of their own identity.
Yeah, you talk about the relationship between fictitious and reality. Back, I think another paradigm and the triumph of the will, and David Bowie modeling himself on that form of perverse narcissism. So that there are kind of there's a dynamic relationship between the two in that sense. And yes, it can go one way or the other. It can be merely performative, but then it can lean towards. I think of other artists that, like the former singer Kasabian, the local Leicester band, who almost is this connection between his stardom and in some ways it's interesting because his downfall was that in some ways was partly because he was this very well-known figure, and it was in some ways, so perhaps politics, the gender politics has changed, that it was seen unacceptable for him to behave in a monstrous way to his girlfriend at the time.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things here. I think that obviously we're dealing with very complicated territory here, because there's, you know, people's performative images, their public images, there's how audiences take those, and there's different points in time and so many things going on. And you know, we can go back. I mean, I found out recently that some of the rock and roll and rockabilly bands that kind of covered classical music had their records banned by the BBC because they thought that would enrage the audience. So maybe, you know, doing like Peer Gynt's Hall of the Mountain King would have been seen as a monstrous thing if you did it on rock, sort of early rock guitar. But I don't think that it's. I mean, I think John's idea is really interesting, but I also don't think that it's maybe help, or there are obviously several books that people could write all about this. I don't personally think it's necessarily healthy to go round sort of pinpointing what you think is monstrous or what you think isn't, and sort of generalizing. I think it's much better, as in terms of cultural studies, to actually spot points where people have called things monstrous and then start investigating and saying, well, why did that happen? What was monstrous about that? What can we learn from that situation? And I think in a sense the book is about that.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think our attention has been to the way that this plays out in the discourse, rather than trying to provide a diagnosis. I mean, you know, at one or 2 points, I think we draw back and say, well, it's risky diagnosing individuals in monstrous terms, and you know, so Mark's point is very well taken there. Yeah.
Okay. Is that a good place to end?
I think so. Thank you very much, Scott, for presenting this.